The independent commission investigating the mass shootings in Lewiston met again in Augusta today. They heard from members of the U.S. Army Reserve, some who served with Robert Card and some who took part in the search for Card after he killed 18 people. Katie Sharp reports.
The independent commission investigating the mass shootings in Lewiston last October received what the chair called a voluminous amount of materials Wednesday from the Army. Members of the reserve who testified before the panel Thursday were either involved with Robert Card's unit and/or Card directly before he carried out the shootings. Some are also members of various law enforcement agencies around Maine.
This is a very complex and perhaps surreal situation for me, as I worked very closely with Card in the military, was one of the soldiers that took him into protective custody at West Point last July, and ultimately responded to the active shooter as a deputy sheriff with the Androscoggin County Sheriff's Office.
Each recounted their involvement with Card, starting with the reserve training exercise in New York, where Card was acting peculiar.
Throughout the day and the evening, we collectively noticed that Card was exhibiting strange behavior, and we notified our command.
They gave me their thoughts, what they thought they should do, and part of them was try to get him in for an evaluation because he was hearing voices and there was an altercation. We were starting to read the day before. They said something's just not right, and so I says, all right, well, I trust you guys, knowing what their civilian capacities are and knowing that they've had certain training. So I says, I trust your judgment. Whatever you need to do it and get it done and let me know.
After Card was hospitalized, those involved believed Card had received the help he needed and the issue had been resolved. Suspicions arose when a fellow reservist reported concern in September that Card would cause harm to those at a reserve post in Saco. Fast forward to October 25th, some of those witnesses were part of the search for Card, but they felt a failure in communication led to a delayed response.
There are things that need to be said in order for change to take effect. A true critique and evaluation of critical incidents such as this one cannot and will never be accomplished by consulting department heads alone. As much as no one is going to admit, there is a very political component to this, and that in itself creates a roadblock to real solutions. The additional people that the board should be calling to testify are the actual boots on the ground, the people that responded to the scenes, the ones that dealt with Card in a personal sense, and the ones that were involved in the manhunt on the lowest levels. You will find real answers with their testimony.
Katie Sharp, WABI TV5 News, Augusta.